It's my great honour to welcome you all.
It is a very prestigious award. It means the world to me.
They have great senses of humour.
I like to reveal parts of history to them, for I love making history come alive.
They are some of the best people that you can come across.
To help them open their hearts.
I always come back to this quote. How can we be role models to learners if we're not learners ourselves?
It's quite useful to get out of our bubbles, not our COVID ones, and sort of see what else is out there.
By sharing best practice, we can see the whole picture. We can see what really matters.
One of the biggest brains around.
It's easy to forget how much has to happen behind the front line.
As a global schools group, Cognita educates over 55,000 students across 12 countries. We're proud to be Wellbeing Partner at this year's Festival of Education, and we want to share the work that we're doing to prioritise children's well-being. This starts with a clear understanding of what well-being is. We looked at the evidence and created a simple Be Well charter that everyone can use day to day. It gives a clear definition of well-being and then focuses on specific contributors that influence it. Discover our full Be Well charter video and other resources to use with your students and families at cognita.com.
I really try to not look at myself as just a science teacher. I feel like as a teacher, it's very important to help students grow and develop outside of your lessons. A single teacher believing in you and really believing in you. One teacher doing that can have a large impact, but if you have one or two or three all telling you that and really, really believing in it, it makes you feel like you can achieve anything in the world, honestly.
Welcome to this Festival of Education keynote session, part of the annual Festival of Education, taking place online from the 16th to the 30th of June. This year's festival is free for all teachers and educationalists across education in the UK and beyond. This has only been possible thanks to the support of our incredible partners. A huge thank you to our headline partner, Pearson, our festival partners, BBC Bitesize, Cognita and Teach First, our literary festival partner, Bloomsbury Publishing, and our organising partner, Wellington College, the home of the Festival of Education. We'd also like to thank our incredible speakers. Over 200 leading educationalists and thought leaders will be providing sessions at this year's festival. On behalf of the audience and organisers, thank you. It's time to sit back and get set for our upcoming keynote session. If you wish to ask a question during this session, please head over to our Slido page to submit questions and vote for your favourites. Enjoy this Festival of Education keynote session.
Hello and good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us for today's session. And today is definitely a session I'm really excited to be hosted, asking that question of can schools do everything? And it's a big question for me and a really interesting one to me, because I know that back just over 10 years ago when we first set up the Centre for Education and Youth, one of the reasons we did that was because we were so keen to think about education and youth. And to move away from an idea that schools had to do everything. So I really want to know whether the panel agree with me on that, because back then it was a funny time to be coming up with something that existed for that reason, because it was just when we moved from having a department for children, schools and families to having a department for education. So we were very much swimming against the tide when we said that perhaps there was more than schools in the picture of supporting young people. But then 10 years later, I found myself editing Young People on the Margins, the book that we've just published. And as I did so, I looked through the chapters that all my colleagues had contributed to that. And I was trying to work out what some of the big themes in that book were. And as I looked at them, I really kept coming across this idea of how schools work with other agencies and how other agencies work with schools, and thinking about what it actually meant to involve more of society in the important task of bringing up and supporting our young people. And then I found us not so much swimming against the current, but with the current a bit more, but for the worst possible reason, because as the pandemic struck, I found that suddenly people were saying, wait a minute, we just can't do this. We cannot do all the things that we need to do to help young people to get through this crisis. And so suddenly people started talking about this a bit more. And I think this is now a really live and important discussion in our society to think, can schools do everything? And if not, what can we do and who can help? So I'm really excited today to have brought an absolutely brilliant panel together to help us explore that question and to think about it. And so what we're going to do today is we are going to hear briefly from each of our panelists, so 5 amazing panelists. So they're going to share with us their thoughts, where they come at this question from. And then we're going to open that up to some discussion. So I'm really looking forward to hearing some of your questions as an audience through the Slido. And I also have a few of my own questions, which I've been grappling with and can't think of the answer to. So I'm hoping that this panel will be able to help me with some of them. So anyway, let's move on to that panel. And I'm going to kick us off with by asking Sam Twizzleton to speak to us for 5 minutes on this question.
Thanks, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to such a brilliant panel. I definitely feel like a novice amongst experts here. My day job is Professor of Education at Sheffield Hallam University, but I actually wear loads of other hats as well. And the hat I'm mainly going to be wearing today in answering this question is as a Deputy Chair of Doncaster Opportunity Area Partnership Board, because my answer to this question, which is in some ways a straightforward no, but obviously much more complicated than that, but in particular arises from really recent experience of seeing what happens in Doncaster when you're responding to a global pandemic. So my answer is no, they shouldn't, but they have really tried. They really have tried in recent times, and there is some learning, both short term and medium term, from what they've done. So the opportunity area is obviously set up because Doncaster is is a place that represents extreme disadvantage, generational disadvantage, and schools that are serving those communities. And clearly COVID came along and completely accelerated and exacerbated that already existing situation almost overnight. So we had lots of families on 0-hour contracts, generational unemployment, etc., which that became families in crisis if they weren't already. And we saw things like domestic violence, suicide, etc., rapidly increasing. And in particular, when schools were completely locked down, apart from for key workers, a real worry about the lack of eyes on a lot of very vulnerable children, and indeed children who became vulnerable as a result of the pandemic. And what the schools did in Doncaster is they absolutely stepped up to what they saw as a massive crisis, not just in terms of learning. In fact, learning, if I'm honest, wasn't their initial response. Their initial response was, how do we keep these children safe? How do we make them secure? How do we make sure they're fed? And so on. And what I sort of, as somebody watching a step removed from all of this, just watched with awe really was how all the rivalries, all the barriers that had prevented them working collaboratively together previously, suddenly were just completely abandoned. One of the issues pre-pandemic that we saw in Doncaster was a very strange set of dynamics around single academy trusts, multi-academy trusts, local ones, national ones, local authority schools, all struggling to be able to work together because they felt like they had competing priorities and needed to keep pointing in so many different directions. All of that was really enthusiastically abandoned in the face of an emergency, and the barriers that seemed to exist previously were just completely demolished. And that also went for working with other agencies as well as working with each other. So multi-agency working became a really, really important part of the aspect of that response. So in the short term, what that reminded us all, I think, is that all these educators who seem to be in competition with each other actually were so relieved not to be, and to have the permission to be collaborators. And I think educators are natural collaborators, and we need to think about that. What are we doing to stop that happening? Because they loved doing it and actually thrived on it. They're completely exhausted, but they've actually loved and thrived on being able to work together. We also saw the importance of the relationships between schools and their communities, and in particular families and carers. And we saw that those relationships were really significantly strengthened as schools naturally learned more about the life circumstances of their children. And I think that developed trust on both sides, which I would hate to see dissipate now. So in the long term, I suppose what I want to say is definitely schools can't do everything and shouldn't do everything. They're not trained social workers. They're not health visitors. They don't know all the skills that are needed to really support these families. But what they are natural hubs for their community. And there are natural points where trust and relationships can thrive and be developed. And I think we need to hold on to that. It does take me back, if I'm honest, to Every Child Mattering and extended schools and all that multi-agency working that was really put front and centre of policy development during that time. I think the good news is that there are some promising signs, certainly arising from the opportunity area discussions and what might come after it, that there does seem to be an appetite for a more place-based approach to how we support education and how we support education in that much broader sense of it needing to join up with all the other things that impact on it. I would hope that policy, as it develops, will really recognise what's going to be there, whether you want it to be there policy-wise or not, is the natural hub that schools represent. But it's unsustainable to carry on doing it like being done at the moment. It's exhausting for school leaders, but also they're not trained social workers, etc. We need to use the school as a hub to bring in that expertise externally rather than expecting schools to do it all for themselves.
Yeah,
that's me.
Thank you, Sam. Great. Okay, right, over to you, Ndidi.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Really great to be here. Thanks for having me. So my name's Ndidi Okezi. I'm the CEO of an organisation called UK Youth. I started as CEO last year after spending 20 years working in the formal education world as a teacher, school leader. I've been an executive director of the charity Teach First. So I really came into this role thinking that I knew this space. I've worked with on behalf of young people for 20 years. This is going to be great. I understand all things to do with what we can do in this space. And apart from the fact that we entered a global pandemic, one of my biggest reflections was just so many light bulb moments for me in terms of recognizing and really understanding a sector that for some reason, although I'd spent 20 years working with young people from a schools context, I was woefully unaware of in terms of the youth sector. So just to give you a bit of an overview, UK Youth, we're a leading charity. We have a vision that all young people are equipped to thrive and empowered to contribute at every stage of their lives. I'm sure that's a vision that you can find in many, many schools. We're a hybrid organisation, so we work in partnership as a sector supporting infrastructure body. We're a direct delivery partner for programmes. We're a kind of campaigner for social change as well. We have an open network of over 7,000 youth organisations and nation partners who are collectively working with over 4 million young people. And my biggest aha moment was being exposed to the skill set and the expertise of people who just know how to work with young people that, from my experience, schools have often really struggled to work with. And I don't even mean at the point of an issue on escalation. I just mean in terms of understanding how to communicate and engage with young people on their terms. It's a skill that I wish I had understood more, not only in my teaching practice, but particularly in my work at Teach First, in my work at Pearson, when there was so much of our work that was focused on addressing teacher workload issues, the idea that teachers felt they had to do everything. The straightforward answer for me for this question is, it's an obvious no, but almost the question is in the fact that it's an obvious no, because we have kept trying for schools to do everything. And so my kind of scratching head moment is why are we still trying to imagine that a school can be everything every young person needs? And I guess in terms of the challenge to this group, maybe some maybe controversial statements or things, but I'm not sure that the school has to be the central hub. Even if we kind of agreed that, you know, there needs to be a coordination and a alignment, it almost feels like it's the obvious hub, but we also know that some young people aren't found in schools at the moment. You know, there are all sorts of different ways that we know that we have to work with young people. So this might sound like a little bit of a cop-out, but I think the community has to be the hub. And in a way, there almost needs to be some parity with how the community agencies come together. Because I can say this as somebody who's spent 20 years working in the school. I think there's a level of arrogance in our education sector that assumes that the teacher always knows best, that the school always knows best. And I worry that if we position the school as the anchor, we don't allow the parity of expertise to come together with the young person truly at the center and say, what do we need to do for the young people in our community? There's just a question mark for me around that. It feels very odd for me to say that, but there's just a question mark that I'm struggling with there. And then the final thing I think I'll say is that one of the things that I think is an uncomfortable truth that I think is connected to this is that there is a real lack of awareness of what happens in different sectors. One of the things that we focused on at UK Youth in our new strategy is, you know, one of the key problems that we want to solve is the lack of awareness of the difference that youth work makes to young people. Because I think that part of the hindrance to solving ways of working is almost a respect of the expertise and the skill set that others bring. And I think if you're not exposed to that, you can't just manufacture that. So I think there's a question mark around how we create more awareness and cross-pollination of expertise so that people understand that there's a win here for what you're trying to do as an individual. There's a benefit to you by engaging with other sectors.
Thank you. And thanks for also there for kind of raising some really juicy issues for us to get into. And I think if people want to get involved in discussing that on Twitter, that's great. And also to start bringing in some questions. I think there's some really important thoughts there. Are we being arrogant in schools when we see ourselves as the hub? What does parity of esteem mean? How do we build awareness of what different practitioners do, and who should the hub be? Lots there to get stuck into. So I'm really interested to hear the audience's thoughts on that too. And over to you, Anna.
Thanks, Loic, and I really appreciate the invite to come and talk this afternoon with many experts on this topic. So, Anna Trith-Ewey, I'm Head of Strategy at Ofsted. Prior to that, I worked with you, Loic, at the CFUY with a fabulous team there, and I've been a teacher and youth worker myself. And like any good ex-English teacher, I bring to you a metaphor for this. So just work with me here. I want you to think about the game Kerplunk, right? You know the one. It's got the plastic tube, all the marbles, and then the straws to hold up the marbles, and you have to take away the straws, and the aim is to keep those marbles up as much as you can. And I think with this, you can see where I'm going here. There are many straws that hold those young people and those children and young people, and we really owe it to ourselves to think about the mesh and the net and how those different services interweave. Because I imagine for many school leaders and teachers, practitioners working on and listening on this call, they will have seen the straws being pulled out from underneath them. And they're trying desperately to keep and hold those young people, particularly the ones who've had the hardest start in life. And they know that there's only so much that they can do. So can schools do everything? Well, of course not. There are some really important things they can do. And I'm just going to talk a bit about our recent review into sexual abuse in schools and colleges. There were some key things that came through here. So just to speak to Ndidi's point, I think this is an area where school leaders know that they do have expertise in terms of how they know the children and thinking about how they can support them. But actually they do feel quite unconfident in this area. And they really do, particularly when there's incidents that arise, they do want to work with multi-agencies. They do pull in the people that they need to, and they're following the legislation as they should. But there is something really powerful that I think that they can do, and that is around building trusted relationships. I'll give you a quick example. So one of the designated safeguarding leads that I spoke to when I was out shadowing one of the research visits, she talked about an incident where a young girl had come to her, and this will probably be familiar territory to some people listening, and said, if this, hypothetically, if this thing had happened to me or a friend, and I wanted to talk to an adult about it, what might happen? And the DSL just spoke so sensitively about how she'd help that young person on the journey to be able to then talk about something pretty horrific, actually. And she'd held that young person's hand as they then spoke to the authorities, police came, social workers, all of the different experts in that safeguarding space, that she was able to walk with that child on their journey. And that just feels really powerful to me, in a way that how can you advocate and build those trusted relationships that brings change? That's what schools do really well when they see what a young person needs and they meet it where they are. And actually, sometimes those straws, they may well be being pulled from underneath your feet. And I think collectively, there is a lot we can do to address not just this issue, but a range of issues. We've talked in recent years about mental health, about knife crime, about SEND and better support and multi-agency working. We ask ourselves what this looks like. Well, I think for the school, it's knowing when to pull in those experts and when to be able to help the young person on their journey. There's things we can all do in this. We've held up a mirror to some of our own practice as well to think about how we might tweak our frameworks and how we might think about better training our staff. So I think there's a whole range of things that we can all do to be those straws. And I won't waffle too much because I've got a short 5 minutes, and there's lots of other experts I want to hear from. But I've obviously used the metaphor of a game to talk about this. We know we're not talking about games here. Like collectively, how do we hold those children and young people who really need the support and oversight that they can get? I think schools are a really important jigsaw puzzle piece of that. They're certainly not the only one. So I think it's about collectively upping our game to hold those children as best we can.
Thank you, Anna, and really useful to see how that fits with this really important work that you've been doing recently. So thank you for sharing that. I do have to say, one of the things we missed about Anna since she left us at CFUY is definitely the metaphors. You definitely paint a clear picture with them. So thank you. And one of the other people we've enjoyed working with a lot at CFUY recently is Janice. So Janice, we'd love to hear about your experiences in this realm.
Hi everyone, I'm Janice Allen. I'm a head teacher in Rochdale of a large 11 to 16 secondary school. So I think schools should be able to do more and can do more. We're well placed to do so. No other agency's got the direct impact on young people and families and communities, or the direct reach as schools have. And if you believe, as I do, that a successful school is one that is part of their community, not dictating to the community, but creating equal partnerships with third sector and statutory partners, then now is the time to start thinking more clearly about how we work in a multi-layered, multi-agency approach. Because if we don't, I think the implications for young people will be enormous, not just those on the margins, and no single agency can cope. So, however, I do qualify what I say by saying that whilst we should be able to do more, it needs to be recognised and invested in. And if we are going to place schools as community hubs and to use effective evidence-enriched early help to help us become more preventative, then we can't simply be at the recipient of diktats such as schools need to sort out mental health or schools need to sort out sexual abuse. We need to be talked to. Don't tell us, ask us, because actually we might have some ideas in developing strategies at the outset. I'm going to share with you 3 projects we've done at our school and to show how a multi-layered approach can be very preventative. So the first one, in looking at youth violence, what we have done for 2 years is work with Early Break, a substance misuse charity, the Youth Service and Youth Justice. We identify pupils in Year 6 whose parents may be incarcerated, who may be struggling at school, and we provide support in the Year 6 summer term, over the summer and into Year 7. 3 times a week, youth workers and substance misuse workers come into our school and they share information with us about the weekend. We have one-to-one, small group work. They support us on duty in the park and the surrounding area up to 6 p.m. So when we go home, our youth workers stay out. Youth Justice work with bystanders of fighting. We share training. So any training we're able to offer, we offer that to our partners. Youth violence in the community invariably will play out in schools, even if not explicitly. And this proactive work helps us to minimise any issues and prevent criminality. It also gives pupils another trusted adult in whom to confide within the school environment. The second project is one we have done during lockdown, which is where we've built a community wing of the school to develop social action and social justice. We work alongside place-based third sector organisations. We engage in our Children Engaging campaigning with Citizens UK. We give children a voice and a chance to have their voices heard. We promote active citizenship. Through focusing on place-based organisations, what we are able to do is we are well equipped to support families with, for example, securing housing or funds that they may be able to get. Working with school helps the third sector secure additional funds. So we call on them when needed, they call on us when needed. It's a wraparound family support that avoids duplicity of scarce resources. The third project is looking at gender abuse, sexism and honour-based violence. And what we have done is we use the University of Bedfordshire contextual safeguarding tools to look at what was taking place in our school about 2 years ago. We then partnered with our action plan with Rochdale Women's Welfare Association. We created white ribbon champions in our young men. They go out, they speak to other pupils in school. And one of those young men has since delivered training for professionals on honour-based violence and is active in his mosque educating others. So each of these projects, and we do run many more, are similar in that they're co-created and co-delivered with third sector and statutory organisations. We don't dictate, nor are we simply recipients. They don't focus on short-term fixes, but are designed to be systemic. They're ripples of hope, and to paraphrase Robert F. Kennedy, whom we are a partner organisation with their foundation, with these ripples, they cross each other from a million different centres of energy and daring, and these ripples build a current positive action. So we should do more. We can't do it alone. And in my view, there now needs to be real thinking and action about what may work, what is working, and how we scale it up. Because if we don't, we risk duplicating those scarce resources or try and fix problems with interventions that may not work or be even worse, harmful. It is hard to be a leader in schools. It's harder than it was perhaps 5, 10, 20 years ago. It can be even harder being a leader in areas of high deprivation where the intersectionality of race, gender, faith, and the mistrust and miscommunication knocks on your doors. But through the work we've done, it's given me hope, and that makes me a better leader, and that makes me improve teaching and learning in a better way. And there's extraordinary hope in our young children, and we've got to be able to allow that to cherish and to flourish. And to do that, we have to think differently, because in my view, one child who falls through the net is one child too many. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. And thanks so much for having some really concrete examples there of the ways you've been able to take some of these challenges on. I think that's really useful. And if people do have questions about how Janice has gone about that, then please do share them. And I'm sure Janice will have lots more to say on how she's done that. So from a chalk face to Westminster, over to Emma. What's your thoughts?
Thanks so much. Thanks for inviting me. I'm Emma Hardy. I'm the Member of Parliament for Hull West and Hessel. And before being a Member of Parliament, I was a primary school teacher, particularly an infant school teacher for 11 years in the local area, just next to where I represent now. When I joined Parliament, I joined the Education Select Committee. I then was Shadow Universities Minister, and now, as a slight change, I'm on the Treasury Select Committee. So I've been involved in talking about, writing about, active within education for the majority of my working life. And I think when we start any conversation or any debate about an issue like this, we need to accept the country and the situation as it is, not as what we imagine it could be or should be. So if we're talking about should schools do everything or not do everything, we have to accept the fact, has been mentioned by previous speakers, that schools have been replacing the gaps in the safety net for a number of years now. When I look at some of the schools in Hull, particularly in the work they've been doing, for example, in setting up food bank distributions to children over at the weekend with a scheme called Backpack Buddies, which goes out to support them with the work they do on Thursday mornings in providing a food pantry with small donations for food for people in the local community, to all the work that they carried out and supported young people with throughout the pandemic, of which we're all eternally grateful. So whether or not we think they should or shouldn't, the fact is they are, and they are doing it because of the resources being depleted from everywhere else. And we'd quite like to say, and I thought it was really interesting challenge from Nadidi about schools not having the arrogance to think that they should be the hubs. But in quite often cases, they are, because they're the only building left. I'd love to say there should be more youth centres, or we could place it as a youth centre. But when we've seen the cuts to the youth centre provision, we find often, again, talking about where I represent, there's an amazing youth centre, but it's just one in one particular area. Schools are useful as a hub and as a resource of bringing together different agencies and bringing together different workers, because they are out there in the community. And much as I'd like to say, well, we could use the community centres instead, some of those community centres are no longer there. And that's why I say we start this conversation with acknowledging the situation as it is, not as we imagine or wish it could be. So in fact, I'm going to separate out the two parts of this and say schools could do everything as a hub, as a resource, as a centre, as a place to bring together different professionals in a way that I know for myself when I was a teacher, when we had difficulty around EHCP plans, for example, was always the how do we get everyone to work together? Well, there could be a way of actually moving them together, physically being together to help improve that communication through different departments, which would particularly help children, I believe, with education, with EHCP plans. But I think we need to separate this from teachers. Having been a teacher myself, clearly teachers can't do everything. And I found as well, being a teacher, I remember someone once talking to me about every child matters, and one teacher saying to me, yes, every child matters except our own, because we take on more and more responsibility and find at the cost to our own family lives and to our own children. So clearly teachers can't do everything. But if we think about the school and the way the building could be used and utilised, the way that it is there in the hearts of different communities, and the way that other buildings just simply aren't, in the way that other resources just simply aren't there, especially with the erosion of Sure Start and the erosion of those centres that communities have faced as well. So I think it could be in the best way possible. But then again, going back to my point, let's see the world as it is, not the world as we'd like it to be. If we say, let's make schools the hubs of these communities, let's see what schools can do to offer that multi-agency support for young people, the next challenge is, okay, so where are all these people then? Where are all these additional social workers? Where are all these additional youth workers? Where are these additional speech therapists? Where are these additional counsellors to support people with mental health? The reality is that we're existing on a shoestring. The resources are depleted, and it always seems to be a scramble to get them to the area and to the young people who need them the most. And until we recognise that if we're really going to protect every child, and I still think every child matters, always have, always will, if we are seriously going to do that, then we need to look not just at resourcing education, but putting in, I think as Anna put it, put the straws back in the kaplunk. Okay, that's what we need to look at providing. And as it stands at the moment, clearly schools can't do everything if they're left on their own. And I really worry about burnout rates of teachers and retention as they keep trying to mend that patchwork, which is quite broken, I think, at the moment.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for that. So yeah, I think we've got lots here around safety nets, all the straws in the kaplang, all the patchwork. You know, everyone's touched on that in different ways. And I think my first question to you all is around how much we've talked. There's an element of this which is about kind of location. You're talking about, you know, is it about people being in the same place? But there's an element of it that's about coordination. So if we want to strengthen that safety net, and we want that's really going to require some coordination. But at the same time, I know Ndidi, you had one of your Are You Convinced podcasts recently where we talked about this, and is that coordination going to be a talking shop, or is it going to be something tangible? So how do we coordinate in a way that isn't a talking shop, and how much does co-location matter? That is my first question to you. So you know, who wants to come in first on that? Wave at me.
I'm happy to pick up on that. I think you touched on it. So we one of my kind of aha moments of the year and trying to bring this conversation together is we do a podcast with Laura McInerney where we're explicitly trying to bring the education world and the youth sector world at the very beginning together around key topics, and we spoke about this idea. And for me, the fascinating thing is the pushback is often around, oh, it's too difficult, you know, it's not, oh, how are we going to do it, you know, all of these for me, and this is my bias, but I think we get tied up in almost the beauty of the challenge. And, you know, we want to theorize and kind of stress about all the different ways we can do it and why there's a barrier. And I always just come back to, how is what we're doing now working for us? Like, it just doesn't make sense that we are satisfied with a context that we are all clear is not working, so much that the attempt to try and do something different is stopped because we imagine it's too difficult. And I'd love to actually hear more of the views around the table on this, but that for me is the big head scratching thing. There are too many young people being lost and not supported right now. We are literally talking about knife crime as if it's a topic that's like, oh yeah, some kids get involved in knife crime. This is life and death. Like, we're literally talking about young children losing their lives. And yet our biggest barrier is, I think it's going to be too bureaucratic. That's just me being candid. It just feels like surely there has to be more energy around, well, how can we avoid it being that, still in the pursuit that we have to do something different?
Do you not think on that one though, much as I agree with you, that it's also headspace, that because teachers and schools are right at the front dealing with, well, not just the pandemic, but the everyday, the new challenges, the things coming out, that it's almost having the space to think through this problem and think through a solution. I think everyone does acknowledge it's not, well, nearly everyone acknowledges that the situation at the moment isn't working. But I think it's not that it seems maybe too bureaucratic, but it just seems like it's too much. I think the emotional energy and maybe the resources needed to say, right, what are we actually going to do is really difficult when you're dealing with sort of the emergency day on day. And I just wonder if it's a continual challenge, if there was a way to give school leaders and people working in education the space to solve the problem, they could, but when can we ever give them the space to solve the problem?
You have to carve that out yourself, though, don't you, as well, in some respect. There's a responsibility on school leaders to be able to do that too. And I think that one of the things that there are structures that are available, for example, the local Children's Safeguarding Board, various different groups that come from that. We don't necessarily use them as well as we could do. So as Ndidi says, they can become very bureaucratic. We're focusing on the acute end rather than the sort of, you know, the bulk. So if you look at, for me, if you look at youth violence, what is interesting is there are structures in place for those children who are involved at that acute end. I want to work with the 60% of children who are witnessing it, who are scared about walking to school, who are scared about going out. And that's where, if we engage with our youth workers, with our different services and seek those out in our local place-based areas, that can be more successful. And just in terms of, you said, of who can pull this together and coordinate it, that's where I think we have to go to our third sector partners. You know, we've got a civil society for a reason, or that's what we want, a healthy civil society. There are people out there, and it's incumbent on us as school leaders to seek those people out.
Okay, I'm going to turn to Sam, and then I'm going to do a combined question of the 3 questions that have been coming through on the Slido. So any other questions on the Slido, do get them through, because we will run out of time much sooner than we want to. So yeah, get them in. Over to you, Sam.
Yeah, as usual, I don't really have an answer to this, but I do think there is potentially some learning from what's worked in the opportunity areas, both pre-pandemic and since, in that it's got all the right people around the table. Initially that was because they wanted the money. They wanted the hands on the resources, and that got everybody at the same table. And I mentioned the rivalries that existed. It took us at least a year, if not more, to kind of build enough trust for people to admit they even existed, let alone do something about them. So there was something about people needing to be at the table and it not just be a talking shop. They wouldn't have been there if it was just going to be a talking shop. And we're now grappling with what happens when the opportunity area finishes, and we still want all these people to come around the table. They all say they want to, they all recognise the value of it. But if I'm honest, if there's not money to be gained from it, I do wonder. Having said that, the DFE team who worked with the opportunity area did provide that coordinating function. Now, I suppose you could say in the old days that's what local authority would have done, and obviously local authority was at the table as well. But there is something about somebody needing to sort of glue all the different parts together and do that work behind the scenes, so that when people do come together, the time is maximised and it's really focused on solving the problems rather than just a lot of hot air. So like I say, I don't think I've got the answer, because we are genuinely really worried what happens. We all want to carry on working as we have been in this very collaborative, very energised way post the funding for the opportunity area. But I do have some worries whether actually it'll all fizzle out.
And I think actually there you mentioned, what is the role for the local authority in the coordination there? And actually, I think that leads us to the question I want to ask based on some of the Slido questions, which is about the role of different groups in this. So we've had questions on the Slido about the role of young people in this themselves. We've had questions about the role of parents, particularly given the sort of rising enthusiasm for home education that we're getting and so on. And then we've also had a question about the role of local authority. And then my question too is, we've talked a lot about place-based things, and is this about things emerging through children's zones and so on, which someone's mentioned, and small scale local things, or if so, what's the role of the national in there? So I want to ask you, what are the role for the different people involved in this, including young people, parents, local authorities, and national government? It'd be great to hear from Anna. You've got any thoughts on that?
I was just going to mention the power of having children and young people's voices at the heart of how you respond to a situation. I always feel like they have a superpower in their ability to just tell it how it is. So every year we do a survey of the care system. Basically, we have 49,000 responses. 7,000 of those are the children and young people themselves, and just hearing their thoughts about, they want to stay and have stability. They want to stay in their accommodation beyond 18. There's some really powerful things in there. And I think part of the reason, that Everyone's Invited website is that kicked off the kind of clearer scrutiny on sexual abuse in schools and colleges, which was about time, frankly. We really, for that, I think the power was in hearing from the young people who were engaged and fed up and done with having to deal with this stuff day in, day out, without the adults coming to help them in this situation. And I think there's definitely something to be said about the power of placing that voice at the heart of any policy making or any response you might have at a school. So yeah, I think that's something to say on that. And then I think there is definitely so many lessons to be learned in what Sam's saying about the Doncaster opportunity areas, and thinking about how you make that sustainable and how it goes beyond an announcement, and thinking about the sustainability and long-term headspace that enables leaders to come together and convene. Definitely something about the urgency of the pandemic, just basically getting people into a room and getting them to get on. And you're right, Sam, that is exhausting. It's not sustainable, the kind of amount of energy and input people have had long term. But there's definitely something about people leaving their egos and their dynamics and their previous histories at the door to just crack on and do what they need to in that situation. If we could do it now, why can't we do it going forward? Yeah.
Just a quick follow-up to that, Anna, is clearly you had this situation with the sexual abuse work where there was a problem in schools, and Ofsted as a kind of national level took a role in that. And what is the role for how much of this needs to come from the top and at a national level, and how much of it kind of emerges from the system and happens locally?
Really good question. And in the report, we make recommendations right across the board. So there were some schools where they were saying, how on earth are we meant to deal with this when it's online stuff that isn't being properly sorted out by the government, that we're feeling that we are just pushing against the tide? It's coming to our door more and more, and it's an increasing problem. So there's definitely recommendations that we put in there to, the online safety bill, we would hope that would address some of those bigger problems. And then in terms of our role, we are one part of that jigsaw puzzle. We haven't been able to be in schools for since March 2019. There will be, increased training and thinking about how we the will have seen there's a blog that came out yesterday and updates to our framework to think about how we can take our part in that as well. So I think there is a collective responsibility that comes across that means that school leaders aren't left lonely and aren't left making really hard decisions when actually there could be better guidance and there could be much more, many more things that would help them on that journey, because it's unsurprising that they've been unconfident and felt alone in some of this, because it's something we all need to address.
Okay, thank you. Okay, right, we have 10 minutes left, so I'm going to go around asking for a 1 minute closer pretty much from all of you. And what I would ask is that you put your comments around what is the subtitle of our book, Young People on the Margins, is Priorities for Action in Education and Youth. And so if I ask you that now, based on what you've said, what is your priority for action? Who's ready?
I'll go for one, if that's okay. Yeah. So, and it kind of relates to what Emma had said before about how do we support school leaders. So I wouldn't be true to myself if I didn't say that the priority for action needs to be that the conversations need to be more about this sort of thing within education, as opposed to are we allowing mobile phones in classrooms? Because I actually think that this conversation that is taking place is valid, and we need to carve out the time for leaders to do that, and that means less centralised information coming down. So that's a priority for action, bigger than me.
Thank you. Sam, were you ready to come in there?
Yeah, so I think my suggestion builds on that a little bit. It really struck home with me when Ndidi said, about the potential arrogance of school leaders and teachers. I don't read it so much as arrogance as sometimes we only see through one lens, because that's the lens that we're measured on, and therefore sadly it means that also how we train teachers. So hold up my hands in terms of initial teacher training. When Every Child Matters was a big part of the agenda at the university I was working at the time, we went to a lot of effort to make sure that our trainee teachers spent time with trainee social workers, school nurses, health visitors, etc. It was really, really hard to do, timetable wise, logistic wise, cultural wise even, but that only the more underlined the importance of doing it. We stopped doing it now because nobody noticed, the agenda moved on, and it's not what we're measured on, sadly. And so because it's hard, we stopped doing it. So my action is to bring that back in, and whether somebody notices or not, because we know it's what's needed.
I can definitely follow that, if that's okay. Like I just got to say again, that even using the word arrogance makes my skin, because I'm talking about myself. But I love the example that Sam just gave. I think is that I think Emma hit the nail on the head in terms of capacity, but I also think there's something about not positioning this as a nice to have, because actually it does make the difference. But when you have to prioritize, it's very easy for it to drop out. So my priority is hopefully a really easy call to action to everyone listening and hearing this. It's a simple question. Do you know the players in your space? So do you know the community organizations in your space, to Emma's point, if they are there, youth workers, social workers? I think every one of us, whoever we are, we should be able to know who is working in our given sphere of influence, and reach out and connect, just as a simple starting point. No other agenda other than I want to introduce myself to you, I want to get to know you, and start from there.
Thank you. Emma, what's going on?
Sure. So I agree with Sam's point about how the pandemic has brought people together. We've certainly seen this in whole. I mean, I did sort of smile when you were talking about how one single multi-academy trust wouldn't talk to a multi-academy trust, which wouldn't talk to, and the pandemic has brought people together and shown that it is possible. I think that if I can be terrible and choose two things, I think one is workforce. We need to address the workforce issues because we don't have enough social workers to deal with the amount of need that there is out there in the community. Therefore, teachers are dealing with issues that in the past would have gone straight to social workers. The same with school staff are dealing with issues that previously would have been dealt with by a school nurse because we haven't got the school nurses going in, all of this capacity issue. So if we're going to sort of look at collaboration and bringing people together, which I absolutely agree with Ndidi and Sam and everybody who's made that point, and Janice, about bringing people together in collaboration and building that patchwork of support, then we need to identify there's massive gaps and not every school has access to the social workers that they should have. So I think workforce has to be a huge priority. That if we're going to give every child the support, then we need to be looking at getting the youth centres back throughout our communities and resourcing them with trained youth workers, getting social workers back. And that's not something, unfortunately, it's not a quick fix or something we can solve overnight, but I think we need to be honest about where the gaps are and then look at how we can fill them so that we can encourage that collaboration. But I think it's a chicken and egg situation. We've got to deal with the workforce problems.
Great. Anna?
So just a quick last point from me. Janice, I'm going to pinch your line earlier, which, I could sit here and give you the one magic bullet or, say, oh, it should definitely be this thing. But you said something really powerful earlier, which is don't tell us, ask us. And I think that bit there, collectively bringing voices together to understand the challenges of a particular area that need to be acted upon, I think that's the priority. And there's been so much energy and space in this kind of emergency period, in this crisis. I'd actually want people just to take a bit of space to go, right, what's next? Let's think about putting in place something careful, coordinated and sustainable, so that it's not just onto the next, because therein burnout lies.
Thank you. And that's, some really, really tangible bits actually there, particularly kind of thinking about, okay, how do we resource this? Because, as Janice said, maybe schools can do more, even if that means not teachers doing more. And I thought that was a helpful distinction from Emma. But they would need to be resourced to do so. And that means both the financial resources and the training up of the rest of the workforce. So I think that was a really, really helpful note to strike. And I think you've all left us with some helpful metaphors, some helpful ideas, which is a really helpful combination. And those of you who are listening in, I definitely recommend if you have a look at Young People on the Margins, you'll be able to find quite a lot more priorities for action. Hopefully that won't overload you, but I think they're tangible and they're practical, and they're also ideas that have come from years of talking to young people, talking to practitioners, because as we've heard today, those aren't answers that will necessarily come from above. But I do think as a closing thought, we do also need to think about how we create the structures and a system which allows all of this great work to happen, because otherwise we do risk ending up in a situation where things are done in some areas that work really well, but not necessarily elsewhere. So, someone in the audience talked about these children's zones and some of the activity, we can see that this is happening in some areas. The work that you've been doing, Janice, that you shared is amazing. But how do we create a system where that doesn't just happen around your school, but that it happens all around the place? So some very helpful thoughts to finish us off. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you all for your thoughts. Those up there.
It's my great honour to welcome you all.
It is a very prestigious award. It means the world to me.
They have great senses of humour.
I like to reveal parts of history to them, for I love making history come alive.
They are some of the best people that you can come across.
To help them open their hearts.
I always come back to this quote. How can we be role models to learners if we're not learners ourselves?
It's quite useful to get out of our bubbles, not our COVID ones, and sort of see what else is out there.
By sharing best practice, we can see the whole picture. We can see what really matters.
One of the biggest brains around.
It's easy to forget how much has to happen behind the front lines.
As a global schools group, Cognita educates over 55,000 students across 12 countries. We're proud to be Wellbeing Partner at this year's Festival of Education, and we want to share the work that we're doing to prioritise children's well-being. This starts with a clear understanding of what well-being is. We looked at the evidence and created a simple Be Well Charter that everyone can use day to day. It gives a clear definition of well-being and then focuses on the specific contributors that influence it. Discover our full Be Well Charter video and other resources to use with your students and families at cognita.com.
I really try to not look at myself as just a science teacher. I feel like as a teacher, it's very important to help students grow and develop outside of your lessons. A single teacher believing in you and really believing in you. One teacher doing that can have a large impact, but if you have one or two or three all telling you that and really, really believing in it, it makes you feel like you can achieve anything in the world, honestly.